liminal scene.
The basement archives at the university were always a place people avoided, mostly because the air down there felt like it was sitting in your lungs, thick and stale. I was looking for a specific series of local history records for a thesis project, the kind of old, leather-bound stuff that doesn't get digitized because nobody thinks it's worth the effort. I remember the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting those jittery shadows that make you feel like your peripheral vision is lying to you. I reached for a shelf, my foot caught on a loose piece of linoleum, and I stumbled. But instead of the jarring impact of concrete, the world just folded. It felt like that split second in a dream where you're falling, except I didn't wake up. I hit the floor hard, but the surface was soft. It was damp, yellowed carpet, the kind you'd see in a failing dental office from the 90s. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just old, it was the suffocating reek of a flooded basement that had been sealed up for a decade. It was the scent of mold and stagnant water that has turned into something oily and sweet. When I stood up, the first thing I noticed wasn't the endless stretch of beige walls or the confusing layout, but the sound. The overhead lights were buzzing with a frequency so aggressive it felt like a physical pressure against my jaw, vibrating right into the roots of my teeth. I figured I'd just fallen through a weak patch of flooring into a sub-basement I didn't know existed. I started walking, looking for a door or a ladder, anything that made sense. Every room looked exactly like the last one, monotonous, sickly yellow wallpaper and that same sodden carpet that yielded under my shoes with a faint, wet resistance. I had a felt tip pen in my pocket, so I started marking the walls near the door frames. I'd draw a simple X so I wouldn't end up circling back. I must have walked for miles. The space didn't follow any architectural logic. Rooms opened into hallways that led to larger, empty halls, all bathed in that relentless, nauseating yellow light. After what felt like 3 hours, I saw a mark on a wall ahead. My heart actually lifted for a second because I thought I'd found a landmark. But as I got closer, the air in my throat felt like it was turning to lead. It was my mark, the same X I'd drawn, but the ink wasn't blue anymore. It had become a thick, raised welt of dark, pulsing crimson. It looked like a scab that had formed on the wallpaper. I touched it, and the substance was tacky and warm. It didn't smear like ink, it clung to my fingertip like drying syrup. That was the moment the reality of the situation shifted from a weird accident to something deeply, fundamentally wrong. Then, the humming stopped. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain until you hear the blood rushing through your own veins. I stood there, frozen, staring at that red mark on the wall, when the sound drifted to the open doorway from about 3 rooms away. It was a rhythmic, wet impact. Squelch. 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 It was the sound of something walking on that damp carpet, but the force behind it was massive. You know how it sounds when someone steps into a deep puddle with a rain boot? It was like that, but amplified, as if whatever was moving had an immense, crushing bulk. The intervals between the steps were uneven, a dragging, limping cadence that suggested something with too many limbs or perhaps limbs that weren't the right length. I didn't scream. My throat felt like it had been cinched shut with a wire. I turned and ran the opposite way. I didn't care about marking walls anymore, I just needed distance. Every time I turned a corner, the yellow rooms looked the same, but the air was getting warmer, more humid. The smell of the carpet was changing too. It no longer just smelled like mold. It began to take on a metallic, raw quality, the scent of a butcher's shop that hasn't been housed down at the end of a shift. It was the smell of meat left out in the sun, sharp and iron-rich, stinging the back of my nose. I ducked into a smaller side room and pressed myself against the wall, trying to mute my own breathing. The footsteps hadn't stopped. They were getting louder. Squelch. Squelch. The sound was closer now, maybe just 1 room over. I could hear a secondary noise now, a wet, sliding sound, like a slab of raw steak being dragged across a porous surface. I peeked around the doorframe, and for a split second, I saw it crossing the far end of the hallway. It wasn't a person. It was a massive pale, translucent tissue, shaped vaguely like a torso but elongated, with multiple appendages that looked like human arms fused together at the elbows. It didn't have a head, just a jagged, weeping split at the top of its bulk that leaked a dark, viscous fluid onto the carpet with every movement. Where it stepped, the yellow carpet turned that same bruised, pulsing red I'd seen on my mark. The thing stopped. It didn't have eyes, but it seemed to sense the displacement of air or the heat of my body. It turned that jagged opening toward my direction. A sound came out of it, not a scream, but a wet, rattling cough that sprayed a mist of that dark fluid into the air. I bolted. I didn't look back, but I could hear the change in its pace. The squelching became rapid, a frenzied, splashing sound as it began to gallop after me. I reached a hallway that seemed to incline upward. My lungs were burning, and my vision was blurring at the edges from the sheer panic. The smell was so thick now I felt like I was swallowing it. I tripped again, my hand sliding into a patch of carpet that wasn't just damp, it was saturated. When I looked down, my palms were coated in a thick, reddish-black grime that felt like grease. I scrambled up, pushed through a set of double doors that looked like they belonged in a hospital, and suddenly, the yellow light was gone. I was back in the university basement. I was lying on the cold, hard concrete, gasping for air. The transition was so violent I threw up right there on the floor. I looked at my hands, expecting to see the grime, but they were clean, mostly. There was just a faint, lingering stain under my fingernails, a dark, rusty color that wouldn't wash off no matter how hard I scrubbed later that night. I didn't tell the campus security the whole truth. I told them I'd tripped and gotten disoriented in the dark. But when I went back a week later, accompanied by a friend because I was too terrified to go alone, we found the spot where I'd fallen. There was no hole in the floor. There was no loose linoleum. But there was a single, square patch of the concrete that felt different. When I knelt down to touch it, the surface wasn't cold. It was slightly warm, and it gave just a little bit, like there was something soft and pressurized underneath. I haven't been back to the library since. But sometimes, when I'm in a quiet room, or when I'm lying in bed and the house settles, I can hear it. It's faint, coming from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, way down in the foundation of the world. It's a rhythmic, wet sound. Squelch, squelch, squelch. And the worst part isn't the sound itself. It's the fact that lately, the carpet in my own hallway has started to feel just a little bit damp, even though there hasn't been a leak in years. It's starting to smell like the basement, and I'm terrified that the next time I trip, I won't come back.
Next story.
The job isn't nearly as high-tech as you think. There are no lab coats or gleaming chrome offices. It's mostly just guys like me in stained high-vis vests, driving unmarked white vans through sleeping neighborhoods while the sun is still a hazy orange smear on the horizon. They call us environment stabilizers on the tax forms, but among the few of us who do it, we just say we're patching the seams. Most of the time, the job is boring. You find a tree that isn't quite touching the grass, hovering a few inches in the air like a bad Photoshop job, and you anchor it. Or you find a brick wall in an alleyway that feels like wet paper when you touch it, and you spray it with a chemical agent that hardens the molecular density. It's mindless maintenance, the kind of thing that makes you forget that the world we live in is actually incredibly fragile. I was working a quiet stretch of Suburbia, one of those cul-de-sacs where every house looks like a carbon copy of the one next to it. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and that stale, metallic tang of sprinkler water hitting hot pavement. It was supposed to be a routine check on a reported texture smear near a storm drain. Usually, that just means the asphalt looks a bit blurry, like a low-resolution video. But when I pulled the van up to the end of the circle, I saw something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Right in the middle of the street, there was a hole. It wasn't a sinkhole or a pothole. It didn't have jagged edges or broken pipes underneath. It looked like someone had taken a razor blade to a photograph of the street and just cut a jagged, vertical slit right through the middle of the air. It was about 6 feet tall and barely an inch wide, just a sliver of absolute, crushing blackness hanging in the space between two parked sedans. The edges of the slit were flickering, vibrating with a frantic energy that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a tear in the fabric of the neighborhood. I stepped out of the van, my boots echoing too loudly on the pavement. The silence in the cul-de-sac was suffocating. There were no birds, no distant hum of traffic, not even the sound of a lawnmower. It was as if the neighborhood had holding its breath. I approached the tear, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I got closer, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just a chill, it was a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to sink past my skin and settle into my marrow. I leaned in, hovering just inches away from the black sliver. I expected to see the sewer or maybe just darkness, but there was a perspective to it. It looked like it opened up into a hallway, but the geometry was all wrong. The walls were covered in a sickly, jaundiced wallpaper, a repeating pattern of intersecting lines that made me feel dizzy. The carpet down there was a damp, brownish yellow, and I could smell it from the surface. It didn't smell like decay or trash. It smelled like old, stagnant sweat and wet cardboard that had been left in a basement for 20 years. It was the smell of a place that had never seen a window or a breeze. Then the sound started. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was incredibly sharp. It was a voice. No, it was 100 voices, maybe 1,000, all speaking at the exact same time in a flat, monotone drone. They weren't screaming for help. They weren't crying. They were chanting. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing recitation of numbers and letters. 42.779, negative 84.32, level 4, corridor B, 42.779. The voices were perfectly synchronized, a chorus of the lost. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. I realized what I was listening to. These were the coordinates of where these people had fallen through. They were reading back the locations of the no-clip zones, the places where the world had failed them. I looked down into that yellow hallway through the slit, and for a split second, I saw a hand. It was pale, the skin stretched tight over the knuckles, reaching up from the bottom of the tear. It didn't grab for the edge. It just hovered there, trembling, before retreating back into the jaundiced gloom. I should have backed away. I should have called for a level 5 containment team. But I was mesmerized by the sheer wrongness of it. I leaned a little further, trying to see the faces attached to the voices. That's when the chanting stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. One voice broke the silence. It was closer than the others, right beneath the surface of the asphalt. It sounded like a woman, but her vocal cords sounded dry, like they were made of parchment. "Don't try to pull us out," she whispered. The sound was wet and raspy, full of a terrifying clarity. "The exit doesn't go back. We found the door. We followed the light. But the light is a lie." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "Where does it go?" I asked, my own voice sounding thin and pathetic in the empty street. "It leads to the other side," she said. I could hear her shifting, the sound of her clothes rubbing against that damp, yellow wallpaper. "It looks just like your street. It looks just like your house. But the sun never rises. The lamps don't work. The stoves don't get hot. And the things that live in the shadows, they've been waiting a very long time for someone to open a door from the top." As she spoke, I saw the edges of the tear begin to widen. It wasn't a slit anymore, it was becoming a jagged maw. The blackness began to bleed out onto the street like spilled ink, staining the gray asphalt. I saw a flicker of movement from within the hole, something thin and far too long, like a finger with too many joints, hooking over the edge of the reality I knew. I didn't think. I ran back to the van and grabbed the industrial-grade stabilizer. It's a pressurized canister filled with a high-density polymer designed to fuse fractured realities. I scrambled back to the hull, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The smell of the yellow room was overpowering now, a thick, cloying stench of rot and wet paper. I pointed the nozzle at the tear and squeezed the trigger. The polymer sprayed out in a thick, translucent foam, sizzling as it hit the edges of the void. The screaming started then. Not just from the woman, but from all of them. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a high-pitched screech that felt like it was shredding my brain. The long, multi-jointed fingers snapped back into the darkness as the foam began to harden, sealing the gap. I kept spraying until the canister was empty, until the hole was nothing more than a bulging, ugly scab of hardened plastic on the surface of the road. I stood there in the middle of the cul-de-sac, my chest heaving, watching the polymer cure. The screaming died down until it was just a faint, distant buzzing, like a fly trapped behind a window pane. I didn't report it. I couldn't. If I told them how close the yellow rooms are, how thin the floorboards of our world really are, they'd never let me leave the office again. I just got back in my van and drove away. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, the thing that makes me stare at the corners of my bedroom until my eyes burn. When I was spraying that foam, just before the hole closed for good, the woman whispered one last thing. It wasn't a coordinate, and it wasn't a warning. She said, "Check your basement, Tommy." My name is Thomas. I've lived in the same house for 10 years. I have never once gone down into my basement because the door has been stuck since the day I moved in. Last night, I stood outside that door with a flashlight. I didn't open it. I couldn't bring myself to touch the handle, but I pressed my ear against the wood. From the other side, through the cracks in the frame, I didn't hear the hum of the furnace or the sound of pipes. I heard the faint, rhythmic chanting of coordinates, and I could smell the unmistakable, suffocating scent of wet, rotting cardboard. The world isn't breaking. It's already broken. We're just the ones tasked with painting over the cracks, hoping the things on the other side don't notice we're home.
Next story.
There is a specific kind of silence that exists only when you are truly, irrevocably lost. It isn't the quiet of a sleeping house or a library. It's a dense, suffocating absence of sound that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums from the inside out. I've been in this beige-walled labyrinth for what feels like days, though my watch stopped at 4:12 a.m. long time ago. The carpet is damp, smelling faintly of sour milk and old laundry, and the fluorescent lights on with a frequency that makes my teeth ache. I had been walking until my feet were blistered and raw, following the endless turns of the yellow wallpaper, when I finally saw it. A door. A simple, industrial metal door with a glowing red exit sign above it. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about why an exit would be in the middle of a windowless hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. I just threw my weight against the bar and stumbled through, bracing myself for the cold air of the parking lot or the noise of the city. Instead, I was met with the soft, familiar scent of vanilla candles and the low, comforting murmur of a television. I was standing in my living room. The relief was so intense that I actually fell to my knees, sobbing. The transition was flawless. There was my worn-out leather sofa, the one with the scratch on the left armrest where my cat used to sharpen her claws. There was the coffee table I'd bought from a thrift store, still holding the half-finished mug of coffee I'd left behind before whatever happened. The steam was still curling off the liquid. It was warm. Everything felt right. The weight that had been crushing my chest for days finally lifted, or so I thought. I stayed on the floor for a few minutes, just breathing in the reality of my own home. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the familiar creak of the floorboards as the house settled. I called out for my dog, Cooper. Within seconds, I heard the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of his tail hitting the carpet in the hallway, followed by the clicking of his nails as he trotted toward me. "Hey, boy," I whispered, wiping my eyes. "I'm back." I'm finally back. Cooper rounded the corner and sat down a few feet away from me. He wiped his tail, his golden fur catching the light from the floor lamp. But he didn't bark. He didn't whine or lick my face like he usually does when I've been gone for more than 10 minutes. He just sat there, perfectly still. I reached out to pat his head, but my hand froze midair. I looked at his face, or where his face was supposed to be. There was nothing. No wet black nose, no soulful brown eyes, no panting tongue. It was just a seamless, smooth expanse of golden fur. It looked like someone had photoshopped his features out of existence, leaving only a blank, furry mask. His head tilted to the side, a gesture I knew well, but without the eyes to follow the movement, it looked mechanical. Grotesque. A cold chill washed over me, the kind that makes your skin crawl as if 1,000 tiny insects are buried just beneath the surface. I scrambled backward, my heels digging into the carpet. As I moved, I noticed the television. I had assumed it was playing the news or some mindless sitcom, but as I looked closer, I realized there was no color, no actors. The screen was filled with a live feed of the yellow hallway. The camera was positioned at a low angle, exactly where I had been standing just moments before I pushed through the exit door. I watched as the door on the screen slowly swung shut. There was no one on the other side. Just the empty, beige corridor, vibrating with the hum of those cursed lights. I looked back at the door I had just entered through. It wasn't there. Where the metal exit door should have been, there was only the familiar framed print of a rainy street in Paris that had hung in my entryway for years. I ran to it, tearing the frame off the wall and clawing at the drywall behind it. I punched the wall, hoping to find the cold steel of the door, but my knuckles only met solid wood and plaster. I screamed, but the sound felt thin and hollow, as if the room was absorbing the noise before it could even reach the walls. I turned back to the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to find a weapon, something to defend myself with, though I didn't know what I was fighting. I ran toward the kitchen, my feet feeling strangely disconnected from the floor. As I passed the coffee table, I accidentally knocked over the mug. The coffee didn't splash. It didn't soak into the carpet. It spilled out in a thick, gelatinous glob like dark syrup. And the smell, it wasn't coffee. The moment the liquid hit the air, the room was filled with a scent so foul it made my stomach flip. It was the sharp, metallic tang of raw meat left out in the sun, mixed with the cloying sweetness of rot. It was the smell of a butcher shop's floor at the end of a long, hot day. I looked down at the puddle. It wasn't brown. It was a deep, visceral crimson. It was thick and pulsating, slowly spreading across the rug in a way that defied physics. I backed away, tripping over Cooper. The dog didn't make a sound when I fell on him. He felt wrong. Underneath the fur, there were no ribs, no heartbeat, no warmth. It felt like I had landed on a sack of wet sand or raw dough. He didn't move to get away. He just stayed there, his faceless head slowly rotating a full 180 degrees to look up at me. I scrambled into the kitchen, my hands slick with the coffee that had splashed on them. I grabbed a steak knife from the wooden block on the counter, but as soon as my fingers closed around the handle, the wood felt soft. It began to melt, the grain of the wood turning into a sticky, resin-like substance that bonded to my palm. I shrieked and shook my hand, finally dislodging the knife, which hit the floor with a wet thud. The blade wasn't metal. It was bone. A jagged, sharpened piece of ivory-colored bone attached to a handle made of something that looked suspiciously like tanned skin. I looked around the kitchen, and the reality began to dissolve. The stainless steel appliances were starting to ripple, like a reflection in a disturbed pond. The cabinets weren't made of oak. They were some kind of synthetic, fleshy material that seemed to breathe if I looked at them too long. I realized then that nothing here was real. It was a recreation, a biological mimicry of my home designed by something that understood the shapes of my life but had no concept of their function or their soul. I stumbled back into the living room, my breath coming in jagged, panicked gasps. The television was still showing the hallway, but now there was something in the frame. Far down the corridor, a figure was approaching. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs swinging too wide, its knees bending at impossible angles. It was wearing my clothes, the same flannel shirt and jeans I had on right now. It stopped in front of the spot where the door had been. It leaned in close to the camera, and for a second, I saw its face. It was me. But like Cooper, the features were wrong. The eyes were too wide, the pupils blown out until there was no color left, and the mouth was a jagged, toothy grin that stretched from ear to ear, frozen in a silent, horrific laugh. The version of me on the screen reached out and touched the wall. On my end, the wall behind the Paris print began to bulge. Something was pushing through from the other side. The wallpaper began to stretch and tear, but instead of seeing the hallway, I saw something dark and wet. The house was starting to groan. A deep, tectonic sound that vibrated in my marrow. The ceiling began to sag, and a dark, viscous fluid started to drip from the light fixtures. It wasn't water. It was thick, dark, and smelled of that same iron-rich decay. It landed on the leather sofa with a sizzle, eating through the material to reveal more of that pale, pulsating meat underneath. I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that I wasn't in a room. I was inside something. This wasn't a trap meant to keep me from leaving, it was a stomach. The exit hadn't been an escape, it was an intake. I ran for the window, desperate to see the street, to see anything other than this nightmare. I tore back the curtains, but there was no glass. There was only a translucent membrane through which I could see the faint, flickering glow of the yellow hallway lights outside. I pressed my hands against it, and it felt warm and elastic. I could see the veins running through it. I turned back to the room, and Cooper, or the thing shaped like him, was standing right behind me. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing on four elongated, spindly legs that had burst through the fur. The patch where his face should be was splitting open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth coated in a thick, translucent slime. I looked at the television one last time. The version of me in the hallway was gone. The door on the screen was opening again. I heard the sound of the metal bar clicking behind me. I turned, and for a split second, I saw the beige hallway through a crack in the living room wall. I lunged for it, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the real exit door, but the room shifted. The floor tilted, and I was thrown back toward the center of the room. The carpet felt like it was beginning to liquefy, my shoes sinking into the fibers as they turned into a sticky, digestive sludge. The walls began to constrict, the living room shrinking, the ceiling lowering until I had to crouch. The smell was unbearable now, the scent of 1,000 open graves in the height of summer. I can feel the heat rising. I can feel the furniture melting into me, the sofa cushions wrapping around my legs like soft, hungry tongues. I'm sitting on the floor now because I can't stand anymore. My phone still has a signal, somehow, though I don't know whose network this is. I'm typing this because I need someone to know. If you ever find yourself in a place that doesn't end, a place of yellow walls and humming lights, and you see a door marked exit, don't go through it. The hallway is lonely, and the lights are maddening, but at least there, you are still you. Here, the house is hungry. And I think it's almost finished tasting me. The TV is flickering now, showing a new room. It looks like a bedroom. My bedroom. I can see a new me walking toward the bed. It's waiting for the next person to get tired of walking. Don't stop walking. Please. Just keep walking.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.